Very briefly, I've put together the key stages in the project management process. Now, feel free to adapt this how you want. I've based this on 4 stages of the project: concept stage, planning stage, implementation, and closeout. Again, if you have more or less stages, you can always amend this to suit. Firstly, in the concept stage, and this is really where the idea of the project comes together. That's how I've used that. I think the first starting point should be to really define the project objectives, to find out where the end is, and also determine the starting point, where we're now versus where we want to be. And that creates the gap which the project should yield the deliverable to solve. Defining objectives, I like the SMART methodology, making your objectives specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and also having a time frame which they will be either achieved on or evaluated at. Key points here, I think, is really to determine as best as possible where we are aiming and what the end will look like. And I think the more that's communicated as early on as possible, the easier the project is, because all the stakeholders start to form a joint understanding of where the project's heading. The next stage, I think, is really just to define the governance structure and make sure each party understands the roles and responsibilities of the other. The key roles I think every project should contain is determination of who is a client. There are many definitions for who a client is. I like to think of the client as the party or entity who will own the deliverable once it's been delivered. The client generally is the person or entity who pays for the project or funds a project. However, in more complex models, this could be a sponsor or a director and so on. So for me, simply, client going to own the deliverable. You can also break your project down into your end users as well, the people who will use the deliverable, because that's not always a client. Importantly also, who will actually manage this project? Who is responsible for ensuring that the project meets its requirements and objectives and efficiently uses the assets that it's being provided to achieve those goals? Finally, who are the technical experts? Who are the resident team members? This could include your internal team as well as a team of contractors and so on. So it's good to define, do we have the skills required to do this? And who are they reporting to? I like the model where the project manager is the central point of communication, where team members should interface with the project manager rather than go directly to the client. I find there's a lot of issues when team members have direct access to the client. So where possible, the project manager should be the conduit of information between the team and the client. Depending on the scale and complexity of your project, you'll really have to go through and determine what level of management is required. Again, I've done this very simple model there, but you might have 5, 6, 8, 20 layers of management, especially with projects that have joint ventures. And really just clarify the lines of responsibility. Who reports to who, who's accountable to who, and in terms of sign-offs, approvals and so on, how does that flow? Next one is to identify the stakeholders for your project. Such a broad term. I like to consider it in 2 dimensions. Initially, who are the parties who have the potential to be impacted upon by the project's activities? And this could be through the course of implementing the project, or who might be affected by the deliverable once it's actually completed. The second dimension of stakeholders are those who have the potential to impact your project. So during the course of the project, they may slow it down, they may speed it up, and you'll find when you do the stakeholder analysis that you might have stakeholders who are very positive about your project and may act as champions, and others who have a rather negative view of the project. Once you've identified the needs and requirements of stakeholders, go back to your objectives and try and identify, can we adjust our objectives to get the majority of stakeholders on board without compromising our original intent and goal? Often some stakeholders, and even the potent ones, just have an issue with a small part of the project. Can we remove that? Can we change it? Or can we work with these stakeholders to possibly design a better solution? Don't take all the views, because some of the stakeholders don't really live in the real world. Some do, and they love the idea, and they're the ones that you should get on board and utilize to actually solidify the plan. Right, so we've got our stakeholders on board. Well, we know their needs and interests at this stage anyway. A project is a one-off chance to do something great. Before jumping in, try and identify what could we do. What are the possibilities? What could be achieved? It doesn't mean you need to implement 20 different variations of this project. It just means let's try and identify what we could do. Then we can make that decision before jumping in. A lot of the great ideas in projects aren't able to be implemented because they hadn't been identified at an early enough stage. And if you consider the cost of change in projects, you'll understand very quickly that at the start of the project, specifically within the concept stages, that is the optimal time for idea identification. Collaboration is the key. Get your stakeholders on board, try and use them to identify what could be done, and try and break the mentality of this is how we've been doing it for 30 years. Collaborative tools such as mind mapping, brainstorming, consultations, meetings, anything where you can involve multiple parties, I find the number of ideas and the quality of ideas is enhanced greatly. Once you've got potential, you will now have to come back to the real world and start defining what are we actually going to do. There are so many options. Let's start defining our actual scope. There are two types of scopes in project management, as you may be aware of: the product scope and the project scope. The product scope talks about the specifications, the deliverable, and focuses on the output. What are we going to get at the end? In this case, what are we delivering? And in this very simple example, my product scope is this house. The project scope is the scope of works, as is commonly known, which is what work do we need to do to achieve that deliverable. So in scope definition, it's useful to develop the product scope first as best as possible. We're trying to deliver this, let's work backwards to identify what work needs to be done. The better you can identify the scope and the clearer you can identify it, the more ambiguity you can remove from the scope, the easier a project is going to be. This is a stage that I see done very poorly, even in large projects. Often there's an urgency to jump into implementation without appropriately defining the scope. A scope matrix is actually a good tool here, trying to identify the inclusions and exclusions of both the product and the project scope. The more inclusions and exclusions you can determine, the more robust your scope is, the clearer it's going to be. The next stage is to develop an agreement. This takes many forms, from a business case to project brief to project charters to contracts. Typically in project management we refer to them as project charters, but that's just a word. This should contain the background of the project, the reasons why we're doing it, the objectives, the key parties, critical success factors. There are many templates available for this. It should also provide an estimate of time, cost, and resource commitments. More importantly, it is a contract. It needs to be well defined and articulated, and it needs to be accepted by all parties. Next stage, confirm the project process. How are we actually going to manage the project once we start? And I think it's a good discussion to have before the project starts. If changes are identified, how will they be managed? What are the hold points? Do we just keep going? Or should we stop at different stages in the project to mitigate risk, to get approvals? I think it's important to identify and to build in our schedules early the frequency of reporting and also the mechanisms for reporting. You can integrate this into your communication plan. Status reports, project meetings, and so on are all a mechanism for that. And it's good to identify the frequency and method early on. My little rule for this, and I've done one for each stage, is don't leave the concept stage until you've got a really clear idea of the project. And also the idea makes sense. In principle, it makes sense. Given you don't have the intricate details of the project, and that's good, but at a high level, the project makes sense and the proposed deliverable will actually solve the needs of the client. The next stage is your planning stage, and this really involves the documentation, creating a baseline agreement, and creating a roadmap for the project prior to starting the project. I think the key component here, and there's a lot of other things involved, such as getting people on board, getting stakeholder commitment, motivating your team, getting the right team, and so on. I've used the documentation approach, which is let's focus on creating a project plan, which should contain all these factors. So step 1, make a project plan. Develop the work breakdown structure and spend some time with this. In project management, the work breakdown structure becomes a key component of your project. I use it as a backbone for practically all of my projects, and a lot of other tools hinge off this. My schedule hinges off my work breakdown structure, my budgets, and so on. So if I do this poorly, everything tends to sort of cascade and fall apart in the same manner. Whereas if I spend the time and detail this well, the project tends to succeed. It also gives you an understanding of how well defined your scope is. When you start getting down to the nitty-gritty, you might say, well, there's big areas here that we haven't confirmed. Are these inclusions and exclusions? And that might be a requirement to go back to the client and get sign-off before the project starts. So you've got your work breakdown structure identified, then go through and estimate your activities. Top-down, bottom-up methods are good for this. You're looking at the different components of each activity. And you can do this at a very granular level, so your cost engineering or your time engineering at a bottom-up level, or you can do it at a higher level. Determine the time requirements. How long will this activity take? How much will it cost? Identify the resources that we might need for the activity. And this will include the human resources as well as specific equipment that we may need. This is important consideration as we may need to procure this. Also for each activity, consider the major risks. And I find this a good task as it shows us high risk activities. And when we start doing risk management, we can start focusing on the activities that have a high risk. Go through your estimates. Within the charter, you propose a high level cost, time, and some major risks. Go through and validate that against your detailed estimates. Does it still match with those in our charter? At this stage, you've actually expended time, effort, and energy to generate these estimates, so in theory, they should be more accurate. If they don't reflect the charter, go back, negotiate with the client, explain, look, in the charter, we budgeted for X. After a detailed analysis, we've got Y. At this stage, you've got options. You can reduce the scope, you can increase the budget, so on. Next, we're adding logic to the activities. Scheduling programs usually take care of this. Again, 90% of it's done. You've got your work breakdown structure, you've got your activity durations, you've got your budget if you want to integrate that with. And all you're doing here is you're just adding logic. So you're adding your predecessors, you're adding lag, and so on. You've got your cost estimates for each task. This can again be done by the computer program. A lot of people use Excel or other financial modeling programs to do this. But your budget is how and when the money will be spent. How much do we need in each period? And this ties in very nicely with your schedule. Quality management plan. Determine the quality requirements, especially of the key sub-deliverables within the project. And try and make everything objective. So when they're being reviewed, you can say definitively, yes, we have achieved that requirement, or no, that's substandard. I find a lot of projects fail because of misinterpretations and very subjective quality criteria. Assigning responsibility for each task. This is where the RAM comes in. The responsibility assignment matrix works really well. The key thing here is having one person and one person accountable for each task. The next one is identifying how and when communication will occur. Considering the cost of communication, consider the risk of the project, consider the stakeholders, and develop a communication plan that really fits with your project. Then go to the client, go to the stakeholders, and confirm the key issues in the project suit their requirements. It may be over communicating from their point of view. They may only want a one-page status report, whereas you may propose a 3-hour meeting. Changing that saves you time. Creating a risk register. A lot of people, and I find even in larger projects, risk is one of those things that's either done very well or very poorly. Risk management isn't a simple exercise to get the project off the ground, fill in a form, tick some boxes, and you've done your due diligence. Risk management becomes an ongoing process. an ongoing activity within the project. Initially, we identify the key risks, we determine their likelihood, consequence, and rate each of these risks, and then we aim to try and manage them within the project. However, things change. These need to be constantly reviewed and updated. Add into your schedules at the points where you may review risks in a formal manner. So weekly, I may review my key risk. I may monitor the actions I've taken to reduce the risk and see if they're effective or not. Once all these key components are done, you should have a nice project plan. And the project plan should articulate quite well how the project's going to proceed. It should be a roadmap, and technically another person could just grab the roadmap and implement the project. Once the roadmap is complete, once the project plan has been fulfilled, once the project plan has been completed and you're confident that this will deliver the solution, get it agreed by the client. Get that confirmation that this becomes the baseline of the project. This is how the project will be assessed down the track. This is the budget, this is a schedule, this is what we're proposing. This is really important to get right, because at the end of the project, your performance as a project manager is usually evaluated against the actual versus what was actually within the baseline document. Key point for this, don't leave the planning stage until, and this is the way I look at it, until I'm confident that I can give the plan to somebody else and they can implement the project just as I would have. Now, that's quite a big statement, and if you actually think about it for a while, if I gave the project plan to another person with similar skills, could they run the project in a similar fashion? Implementation, you've got your plan, and now it's a simple manner of running the project. Most people associate implementation with this is where everything falls apart. This is the most important stage of the project. This is what we need to get right. And I agree with that to a degree. However, in my experience, I've actually found that most projects experience success or failure due to the concept and the planning stages. Very rarely do projects actually fail solely due to poor implementation. There are usually issues within the planning stage or the concept stage that lead to poor implementation. A key one is poor scope definition, and you see this time and time again. Key parts here are executing the project plan, and I'll go through this very quickly. Completing the work as per the work breakdown structure. The work breakdown structure should represent 100% of the work, no more, no less. So no work should be completed outside of that. If there is a requirement to add work or to remove work, that should occur in accordance with the change process. Completing the task as per the schedule, following the order. Again, if you're using a computer-based program, you can probably identify the critical path very quickly and trying using that critical path approach to ensure that the project doesn't experience delays. Also, reporting on the variances. This should have been established with the client as to the reporting frequencies. Generally, this is done within the status reporting. Monitor the budget. Keep a close eye on the costs because things go up. Supply and demand factors may make inflation occur at a faster rate than expected. Again, go to the client, communicate this on a regular basis. The more the client's aware of the increase of the costs, the less surprise it's going to be at the end. And also the more options they have to implement strategies to realize value. Where possible, forecast. I like to present my clients at the status report with, look, this is the current situation, this is a snapshot of the project today. And this is a snapshot of the project today, and this is what it's expected to look like within the next reporting period. The costs might go up by this point due to these factors. And having that discussion with the client gives them the awareness, prepares them for a potential increase or a decrease, and also it allows them to integrate options where possible. Auditing quality requirements. So this is where your quality management plan comes into practice. following through that, doing your tests, doing your checks prior to doing your checks. The more often you review quality, generally the lower the failure costs are going to be. Managing the team, and this is massive, using the responsibility assignment matrix to go through, ensuring that people are actually doing the tasks, that their tasks, meeting the quality requirements, and so on. Where that's not being performed, using that as an option to provide training and development. And I appreciate in shorter term projects this may be hard. This hopefully gets identified within the early stages of the project and training plans are put in. So training is less required during the implementation stages. Following your communication plan, so reporting as per the plan. Keeping the stakeholders engaged. Stakeholders may change their views on the project partway through. Circumstances or the environment may change, which may shift the stakeholder perception. So this is an ongoing thing, just like risk management, keeping in contact with the stakeholders. Monitor changes in risks, explain that one quite well. And implementing your risk controls, how you're actually going to treat these risks. Right, we've been doing the work, everything's done, deliverables finished, let's go see the client. Just pause there and make sure that it is complete. Go through and audit the project against the project plan. Have we completed the scope of works? Have we done all the work that we were assigned? The second one is make sure the deliverable meets all the quality requirements. Test it if it needs be. And I find this is good to do internally within your project team prior to meeting the client. Once you're satisfied that the project scope and the product scope have been completed, sure, project finish. Go through, does our deliverable meet the contract requirements? And this is my key equation for project management. Does our scope of works, does what we promise the client, does what we have in writing meet what we've produced? 99% of cases, this is not going to be true because we've changed things along the way. If we've kept good documentation of this, this is easy. We go, look, project charter plus or minus changes equals deliverables. What gets us in trouble here is verbal changes, changes that shouldn't have occurred, scope creep and so on. It becomes really hard to justify that at the end. Once you're happy with that and the scope has been done, you can move on. Generally, you shouldn't leave the implementation stage if there's still work to do because you're still implementing the project. Closeout. And this stage often just is rushed or ignored because the project's been done. The project team may be looking for other projects, the company's looking for other work, and often that's it. We walk away without doing a decent closeout. This is a key stage in the project, and I find organisations that do this poorly tend to repeat mistakes project after project and don't really learn from the project successes or failures. Easy. First stage, go through the project, and this should have been done at the end of the implementation stage, but examine the performance of each of the attributes. Again, if you can do this within your team prior to meeting the client, it's good, because when you show the report to the client or have a meeting with the client, you've got all the answers. You also know the reasons why potential variations have occurred. So we want to examine the project. How was the project delivered in terms of scope, time, costs, and so on? Did we do a good job? Did we do a bad job? What are the potential improvements the next time? Hand over the project. And project handover is the exchange of the deliverable for the final payment or what was agreed within the contract. This is super easy if the scope has been well defined, if you've actually delivered against the contractual requirements. This gets really hard when you've got an ill-defined scope, murky at best, and there's a lot of ambiguity. And finally, making things better for next time. This should be a no-blame exercise where the project manager documents all the aspects of the project which could be improved on or were noted as giant successes. And the reason for this stage is really to pass on our learnings to future projects. future projects we may do, future projects others within our organisation may do. This doesn't need to be left till the end. This should be performed progressively as the project transpires. As lessons are learned, they should be documented. Doing this solely as a last minute exercise at the end of the project, a lot of things are forgotten. This document also should start your next project. So prior to embarking on the project, identify all the previous projects, grab the lessons learned report, go through them, and try and integrate their learnings into your project plans to get those benefits.